All right. So CSS. All right. So like I said, CSS, that's the way, hold on one second. Okay. That's the way that we style out. It stands for cascading style sheets, which are the way that these style sheets are sort of set up, is that you'll have these files that define all of these styling rules, and you can have multiple of them, and they load in one by one into your browser, into your web page. Basically, they are just sets of rules, and they have two parts. One is your selector, which basically just selects what element you're going to be enforcing the rule on, and then the rules themselves. So which elements we want to style and how we want to style them. That's the way that CSS sort of focuses focuses the work and executes it. So in this case, we say li. We know that that tag corresponds to list items, right? We have those ULs, those unordered lists, and inside of all of that, we have these list items. So for every list item, make it blue, make the font blue. So here on the outside in the red, I have my selector. I have my code that selects what elements we want to style. And then inside of it, in the black font here, we have how we want to style those elements. So selector and then the actual rules. So we're about to learn the syntax for writing CSS rules, some different ways to choose which elements we want to change, some different style properties that we can change, and sort of the way that HTML blends in with style to create the way things appear on a page. So this gives a good, I think, example of why CSS is important. So on the left, we have a web page with CSS, with styling to it. And on the right, we have a web page, the exact same web page with no styling. So first of all, I mean, as you guys can probably see, like the one without the styling looks kind of weird and gross and barren. The one with the styling has some color, it has a good amount of spacing. But why CSS is important, if you just give both of these a glance, is it really directs your eye and gives your immediate eye signals on what's important, what goes together, how different elements on a page relate to each other, and it gives you a more immediate and more meaningful indication of what the experience of this web page should be. If you look at without CSS, you're going to have to do a little extra work in order to determine things like how these thoughts are grouped, which thought is the most important. I see a bunch of link tags. Which link tags will take me where? I'm going to have to do a lot more reading and a lot more sort of parsing of the page than with the one on the left. So CSS styling is a really important tool. It's much more than just making things look pretty. It's actually creating what the experience is for the user and giving the user a quicker experience and telling the user how they should be interacting with this material. So here are the terms that we're going to go over. We have on the outside, that's going to be, the whole thing is a rule, right? Like the whole block of this is a rule. We have our selector, which is a set of tags and symbols as well as like you can put classes, IDs in here. So really it's a collection of the symbols and text that will tell you which specific elements should be affected by this rule. And then on the inside, we have our declarations. Those declarations are going to have properties as well as values. And this is a pretty complex example. We won't be doing anything this complex in this class, but what this does is just give you a little bit of a sense of what these rules can look like, how these rules can be shaped. So in this example, right, like the inside parts, the properties and rules apply the actual styles, and they apply them to any elements matching this selector. So that's kind of the division here, is that on the outside, you have the selector, on the inside, you have the actual rules. Does anybody have any questions on that before we move on here? Okay, good deal. So as we talked about yesterday, right, here on this element, we have 3 attributes, right? We have a class, we have an ID, and we have an href. You can use any attribute to create a selector. You can also use just the actual HTML tag. So for a tag, you have a tag which is an A, you have the class which is full stack, you have an ID which is academy, and then you have this attribute, this other attribute, href. You can also have pseudo elements and pseudo classes. We're not really going to get too far into those today, but those are like hover is a good example of a pseudo class. Like when you hover over something under the hood, it kind of applies like an attribute or like a class to an element. We have another attribute here, like any elements that have a type of file, or we could even do this on this this anchor tag here, this link, where we say any elements that have an href of http://www.google.com, any that have those apply this style. The way that we write IDs in CSS is with the hashtag there. And the way that we write classes is with a dot. So that's kind of like a real rough and tumble overview of some of the ways that we can use selectors. Combinators is a fancy term to say ways that we can combine different selectors, right? So we have a selector that's a tag, and maybe that is, we want something that is a tag of a certain sort that also has a class. So an element with both this tag and this class. Maybe we want something that has a space in the middle. So an element with a class whose parent or who has some ancestor that has a specific tag. Maybe we want to apply style to something that either has a certain tag or has a certain class, so an either or maybe we want something that uses that less than sign to, or I guess greater than sign, to say it has this class and its direct parent matches this tag. This is a lot of information, I know, but we're going to keep working with this stuff, and these things will kind of come naturally. We'll have some redundancy around these so that it's not just a flurry of information. Comments in CSS are written with the /*. So as you can see up at the top there, this is a CSS comment. that can be anywhere in your code. It's not going to be compiled or parsed into your actual CSS. Comments in CSS can also be many lines. So as long as you wrap your comments with that / combination there, you can write whatever you want, and it won't appear in your actual code. So cascading style sheets, the way that it kind of works is that you can have many different files. The way that you do it is you write up your style, and you might cause it like, okay, I'm going to say like base CSS, and then I'm going to do another one that's like more specific CSS, and then another one that's like even more specific CSS. And they will load one after the other. And any rules in later loaded sheets are going to overwrite any rules in older loaded sheets. So here it also talks about with browser, user, and author, it sort of talks about the default style sheets that are loaded into your app. Your browser has its own style sheet where it styles stuff, and that's loaded in first. Then you can define on like Chrome or any browser that you're using, you can define your own styles to use across any website. And those are loaded after the browser. So those overwrite rules that are on your browser's style sheet. And then when you go to a website, whoever made that website has their own styling that they're going to try to apply to the website. That's going to be on what's referred to as an author style sheet. And that'll overwrite any of the other two style sheets. Does that make sense? There's like a whole bunch of slides and a lot of information on this topic. I know we're trying to cram it all in, but we'll have plenty of time to talk about this. Okay, so moving along. The way that these are loaded in is we've seen the body, right? If you look to your upper left box there, we've seen that body element, right? Remember that says the entire page. This is an element that is the parent of the entire document, the entire web page. There's also a section that is a sibling to the body that is called head. And what head does is head just introduces information or maybe pulls in different files or scripts into the web page so that you can use it in the body. And that's where we define our, that's where we load in our style sheets. So there's this specific tag called a link, L-I-N-K, and you specify what type it is. We're going to say it's a style sheet, and then you give it an href. You give it a URL location of where your style sheet is going to live. And the way, the order in which you put these style sheets is going to define how that behavior I talked about, that cascading behavior, and what style sheets will overload others, that'll get determined here. So if we look here between these two boxes to the right here, styles-a.css and styles-b.css, we can see that styles-a has a link tag, and it makes the color of, or not a link tag, rather, a list item. It makes any list item color red. Great. Well, style B also has a rule for the list item, and it puts the font size at 40 pixels. Oh, shoot. Okay, so now we have two different rules for the same tag, for the same selector. What happens here is that B gets loaded in first, but then A gets loaded in after it, and it actually overwrites the rule. So now the style is going to be, it's going to be both. But if I were to write like another font size in styles a.css, right? If I were to say font size 30, then it would overwrite the styles B. The last piece here is inline styles. So I can write this attribute on an HTML element called style. And I can just, any of these style rules, I can just put right there. And they're gonna overwrite everything. So on here, we have 3 rules, right? We have this color red that we get from styles A. We have this font size 40 that we get from styles B. And we have this background color blue that we get right from the inline, is what they call it, this inline style that's defined directly on the HTML. So the what they call the specificity, the order that these would get written into is the inline style, and then styles A, and then styles B. And it's going to look something like that. Any questions on that? Okay. So they're talking about what happens when 2 declarations conflict. Let's say that you have 2 declarations within the same style sheet, so they're not going to overwrite each other. These are on the same in the same style sheet, but you have this div with an ID of thing, right? And then on the style sheet, you have a rule that says all divs have to have a background of red. And then somewhere else on the style sheet, you have this thing that says any elements with an ID of thing have to have a background of blue. So we have this conflict, right? We have this div that's getting 2 rules assigned to it saying conflicting things. One saying your background should be red, the other saying that your background should be blue. So how does this get handled? What wins in this case is this ID thing. Its background will be blue. There's a certain hierarchy of rules for this stuff. And IDs always win out over just regular tags. That's like the hardest and fastest rule. IDs will always beat regular just HTML element tags. In this case, we have a class, right? We have class foo, background should be green. Div, still saying your background should be red. In this case, the class wins. Everything's going to basically beat out just a blank, regular old HTML element tag. Classes beat them. IDs beat them. Now, in this case, we have conflicting rules. One is an ID, and the other is a couple of classes. So what's going to win? The IDs. IDs always beat classes. It doesn't matter how many classes or what combination of classes you have. IDs always beat classes. And then the last part here, right, is we have 3 rules really going on right here. We have the inline, right? If you guys look up to the HTML on the top, you'll see that there is an attribute style that says background orange, right? So we have that style. we have that rule versus this rule to the right. Outer class foo says background green. Inline styles also beat anything. They always trump in any styling that you put on your CSS, your actual style sheet. Your inline styles are going to override those. And then this is sort of a GIF about what it's like developing CSS. Yep. So let's do, I think it would be helpful maybe to do just sort of like a quick run through review, right? Of these slides. So once again, you have a rule. The top is going to be a selector, right? And then inside that, you have these declarations where you define what your property is and you say what the value should be. And remember, these styles should apply to these selectors. The different types of selectors are tag, class, ID. You can do it off of an attribute. And then these two last things would be good to Google, but they're not necessarily within the scope of this class completely. But pseudo elements and pseudo classes are some fun, funky ways that you can also style things. Combinators, right? Combinators are ways of combining selectors. You can have them with no spaces, which means element has to have both things, both elements. If you give it one space, it means that the element on the right has an ancestor, has some parent at some point in the HTML that matches whatever the thing on the left is. There's an either or situation if you use a comma. And then if you use that greater than symbol, the direct parent of whatever's on the right has to match whatever's on the left. We got comments in there, right? Comments. And then we also talked about how the style sheets cascade, how you use this head tag to store or to wrap your link tags. Your link tags are what you use to bring your style sheets in, and the order of where they're defined, of where they're written out there, the later ones, the ones that you put at the bottom, those are going to override any conflicting rules from earlier style sheets. Declarations conflict, right? ID is going to be over a regular HTML tag. A class is going to beat a regular HTML tag. An ID is going to beat a class. And then an inline style is going to beat anything else. Okay. So